The 2022-2023 NFL regular season is over, and it is time for me to bring back my best types of videos on this channel, and that is the ranking every NFL teams on the tier list. Without a doubt, my most successful videos. Each time I've done these videos, I've surpassed a thousand views on both of them. So I've got to do it again. Also, it just makes sense because the first time I did it, it was week 6. The second time I did it, it was week 12. Now we just finished week 18. It is time for me to give my final thoughts about every NFL team from this season. Where do I have them ranked? What tiers do I have them placed in? Before we get into the tier list, though, I want to say if you are interested in seeing my tier list from earlier this season, the week 12 and week 6 one, go check those videos out. They won't be hard to find on my channel. But yeah, let's kick off this tier list with the poverty tier. These are the teams that, in my eyes, are the worst in the league. In my opinion, these have been the 6 worst teams in the league this season. You take a look at it, you could see the teams I have in there, those teams being the Bears, Rams, Colts, Texans, Broncos, and the Cardinals. In my week 6 edition of this video, the only teams I had in here were the Panthers and the Texans. The Panthers obviously fired Matt Rule around this time, and things got better since that point. However, the Texans, it stayed bad for them the entire season. They are the only team that has been truly poverty this entire year. Then week 12, the Texans obviously remained in here, but we also got some new teams. Those teams including the Rams, Broncos, and the Bears. And then fast forward another 6 weeks and we have added the Colts and the Cardinals. Like I've said already, these teams have just been bad, and I don't really think there's much explaining I have to do. I don't think there is anybody that disagrees with these teams in these tiers. The Bears started off the season 2-1. Since that point, they have been horrible. Yes, Justin Fields has taken a huge step in his game, but the rest of the team has just been bad. They traded away Roquan Smith. They traded away, Robert Quinn. They traded for Chase Claypool, who has not done a damn thing as a Bear. And Justin Fields tried to put this team on his back, but it was just too much for him, and he just could not carry them to wins. They definitely had some entertaining games, but they didn't win. To talk about the Rams, they might have just had the biggest downfall of any NFL team in the entire league's history. From going to Super Bowl champions to, I believe, 5-12, that's disgusting. Yes, I know they lost a lot of key players in the offseason, and in season, they had a lot of injuries to very important players on their team, Matthew Stafford, Cooper Kupp. But even when they had those guys, they were still struggling. You take them away from them, and they're horrible. They brought in Baker Mayfield late in the season and had a couple good moments with him. Obviously, that Thursday night football game against the Raiders and the 50-piece that they dropped on the Broncos on Christmas Day. But other than that, it's just been a very dark and gloomy season for the Rams after just winning the Super Bowl last year. The Colts, I just simply don't want to talk about them. You would have to pay me for me to sit through a Colts game and watch the entire thing. All I've got to say is they were another team that had really high expectations going into this year, and they obviously disappointed on those expectations. Texans, we know why they're here, and the Denver Broncos, Nathaniel Hackett. That's all I'm saying. Enough has been said about the Broncos this season by me and everybody who knows football. They had possibly the worst coach in the NFL this season, along with an atrocious offensive line that did not give Russell Wilson help whatsoever, which obviously affected Russell Wilson's play. And I don't think it's all Russell Wilson's fault, but he definitely has some blame in it. He was not himself this year until the final 2 weeks. He struggled to get a connection with his receivers. The run game was bad the entire year. And let's be honest, if it wasn't for the Broncos defense, they might have 2 wins right now. I've got to say it one last time. Broncos country, let's cry, let's die, let's ride. And the Arizona Cardinals were plagued by injuries this entire season, and they won 4 games. And their entire team is about to blow up. D-Hop is 100% leaving, and I won't be surprised if we see Kyler Murray leave in the next 2 seasons. Next up, we've got the bad tier, and this tier was reserved for one team and one team only. The Las Vegas Raiders, baby. Look, I had to put the Raiders in the bad tier by just themselves because the tier I have above this is the mid tier, and that's way too much credit for the Raiders. But the tier below this is the poverty tier, and I feel like the Raiders had some flashes this season that is just too much for me to put them in the poverty tier. So I throw them in the bad tier because that's exactly what the Raiders have been. Bad, a complete mess. The Raiders have got to be the wackiest team in football. I don't know why the Raiders are always like this. They have so much talent on their team, so much talent just for them to finish 6-11. Yes, Josh McDaniels sucks as a coach. If he wasn't the Raiders coach, the Raiders would possibly be in the playoffs right now. Because, like, half of the Raiders' games this year, honestly, probably more than half of their games, were one-score games. Super close games that if the Raiders just had a little more luck on their side, and if they had literally anybody other than Josh McDaniels or Nathaniel Hackett, they would have probably been able to win some of those games. So, Josh McDaniels sucks. We all know this. But also, their quarterback, Derek Carr, did not have the best season. After getting one of the best receivers in the league, Davante Adams, Derek Carr went out there this season and had a very mediocre season. Honestly, probably below mediocre. Dude was a turnover machine and just did not look good. Even an all-pro season from Josh Jacobs and one of the best receiver seasons this year from Davante Adams just wasn't enough to save the Raiders. Which, by the way, those two players were the only bright spots of this Raiders team. Also, Max Crosby. Josh Jacobs, who had a phenomenal season, we all know this. Davante Adams was amazing this season, even with Derek Carr as his quarterback. And Max Crosby was one of the best edge rushers in the entire league this year. Other than that, though, the Raiders were a complete dysfunctional mess this year. But it's alright because everything is going to change when they get Lamar Jackson this offseason and they go 10-7 next year. Then we get into what is probably the most controversial tier in this entire list, and that is the mid tier. By the way, I'm not reading all that. Most of the teams that are in this tier, you could figure out why they're in there, and I don't want to talk about them. But there are 4 teams I want to highlight. Those teams being the Steelers, the Packers, the Bucks, and the Dolphins. The Steelers went 9-8 this year, barely missed the playoffs. The Packers went 8-9 this year, barely missed the playoffs. The Buccaneers went 8-9 this year, made the playoffs as the 4th seed because they are in a horrible division. And the Dolphins went 9-8 this year, barely squeaked into the playoffs. Let's talk about the Steelers, though, because the Steelers started off the season horrible. The first half of the season, they were very bad. They were like 2-6, 3-5, something like that. But then they traded Chase Claypool, and for some reason they just got substantially better. I'm not saying the Chase Claypool trade has anything to do with this. It's just I use that as kind of like a marking as to where the Steelers season kind of turned around. Because they were really good after that mid-season point. I don't know what had snapped into them. I guess Coach Tomlin told them that his winning season streak was on the line, and the Steelers locked in. They went on a great run where they got TJ Watt back, and obviously TJ Watt's going to have an impact. He's TJ Watt. Najee Harris got his mojo back, and Kenny Pickett went from Kenny Pickett, where, you know, he throws a lot of interceptions, to Kenny Pickett, where he's actually really good. I completely messed that up, but basically first half of the season, Kenny Pickett, bad. Second half of the season, Kenny Pickett, pretty good. He cleared up on those turnovers. George Pickens began to break out, and their defense started to play elite, and the Steelers just got really hot. And this recency bias almost carried the Steelers to the good tier for me, but then I remembered how bad they were to start off the season, and that kind of cancels it out, so that's what made me put them in the mid tier. The good and the bad balance each other out, and it creates a mid team. I'm also just a Steelers doubter, so I don't want to put them in the good tier. The Green Bay Packers, everything that I just said for the Steelers could also be applied to the Packers. Literally, their seasons were almost identical. Both started off the season really bad. Throughout the first half of the season, they were looking not good whatsoever. Both looked like they were going to miss the playoffs by a long shot, but that mid-season kind of time hit. Okay, let me not say mid-season because both of these teams were still struggling mid-season. I would say like week 10, 11, 12-ish, that sort of range is when these teams started to pick up some steam. From that point, these teams were really good, and on the final Sunday of the regular season, they were fighting for their playoff spots. So they were able to claw back from being down really bad, but in my eyes, the good and the bad, they both balance each other out. I have both of these teams in the mid-tier. And the same thing can be said for the Dolphins, just the other way around. The Dolphins had a great start to the season, but once that week 10, 11, 12 range hit, they fell off miserably. They did find a way to squeak into the playoffs, though, but this Dolphins team is not that good, especially without Tua. With Tua, I would probably put them in the good tier, but without him, they just don't really have any sort of dynamic on their offense whatsoever. Sure, this Dolphins team was really fun to watch, but once that 49ers game hit, it's just like all the juice was just sucked out of them. They still get to go to Buffalo, though, and lose by 40 to the Bills. But hey, at least they snapped their playoff, not drought streak. I don't know what I just said. And there is still one last team I have to talk about in this tier, the damn Buccaneers. Look, the Buccaneers are probably going to win the Super Bowl with a below 500 record because that's just something Tom Brady would do. But that does not deny the fact that they were a below 500 team in the regular season. And they're not like the last three teams I just talked about, where it was two completely different seasons for them. No, this entire season they were wishy-washy, inconsistent, mid all around. One game they would barely escape with a win. The next game they would barely lose. The next game they would barely escape with the win. The next game they would barely lose. That is just the definition of mid. You're not bad, but you're not good. That's what the Buccaneers have been this year. Yes, they've had many problems. Injuries have definitely played a big part in it. But they could not get their running game going whatsoever this entire year, and their defense was disappointing. Todd Bowles becoming the head coach for this team was not a good thing to happen for them. He was a lot better as the defensive coordinator. And Byron Leftwich, the offensive coordinator for the Bucs, he's been very bad too. And the crazy thing about it all is they still get to host a playoff game against the Dallas Cowboys with a below 500 record with the Detroit Lions sitting out of the playoffs. I'm heartbroken. It's C.J. Henderson's fault. The Buccaneers need to build that man a statue. C.J. Henderson is a Buccaneers legend. Then we move into the good tier, which are the teams that I could describe as the lower tier playoff teams. Basically, to describe these teams, if they were to win the Super Bowl, I would be extremely surprised. And unlike the teams in the mid-tier, these teams have actually had relatively good seasons throughout it, and they're actually talented. I'm just being completely biased if you can't tell by now. We have the Jaguars, the Chargers, the Ravens, the Seahawks, the Giants, and the Lions all in this tier. Now, you might be asking yourself, why do I have the Lions in this tier when they missed the playoffs and I have two teams in the mid-tier that made the playoffs? Well, that's because I believe the Lions are a better team than both the Dolphins and the Bucs. Do I really believe that? No. But the Lions deserve to be here. They should be in the playoffs, but the NFL screwed them, obviously. Anyways, let's talk about the other teams that are in here. The Jaguars. The Jaguars are definitely one of those teams that have had a weird season. They've been wishy-washy and inconsistent. They started off the season pretty bad. I don't know if it was like week 7, week 8, week 9 or something, but they only had like 3 wins. Then, like I said, for other teams, that switch just kind of flipped for them and they became a whole different team. In games where they were down a lot, like games against the Ravens, games against the Cowboys, they would usually just lay down and let the teams run all over them. No, the Jaguars showed life, they showed fight in them, and they fought and clawed their way back into those games and actually won those games. They showed resiliency, they showed heart, they showed fight, And that's what I mean when I say they truly looked like a different team. We saw players step up big time for them. Trevor Lawrence looked like he was fully worth the number 1 overall pick. Travis Etienne, he was playing great. Then some people that they signed in the offseason. Zay Jones, Christian Kirk, Evan Ingram, all these guys who kind of had a slow start to the season really came alive in the second half, especially Zay Jones and Evan Ingram. Those guys were fantasy football legends in the latter half of the season. Their defense began to really step up too. Players like Devin Lloyd, Trayvon Walker, who was the number 1 pick last year, and Rashawn Jenkins, who really broke out. That man is great. He made huge plays for the Jaguars left and right in the later half of the season. Now, honestly, this man kind of carried the Jaguars to the playoffs if you think about it. That's obviously an exaggeration, but that's how important I believe he is to this Jaguars team. So yeah, Jaguars, they had a good year. The rest of the teams in this tier, I think, are pretty self-explanatory. The Ravens were doing great with Lamar. Injuries happened. They fell off, but they still finished 10-7 and are in the playoffs. The Chargers, after having a slow start to the season, they really picked it up in the second half. The Seahawks started off the season great, had a few weeks where they kind of fell off, and then at the end of the season, they woke alive again, got some help from the refs week 18, and the Lions, and they're in the playoffs. And the New York Football Giants, oh boy. I've said a lot about the Giants this year, and I mean, I really don't have anything new to say about them going into this year. I thought they were going to be bad. Even when we were in the season, a good 3, 4, 5 weeks deep into the season, I was still doubting these guys. But they kept proving me wrong. They kept pulling off big wins against teams like the Packers, the Ravens, and had some hard-fought games against teams like the Vikings. The Giants this year, they were a good team. Saquon Barkley was phenomenal. Daniel Jones really took a step up this season with having absolutely no wide receivers. He really was just really good this season. He was a solid passer, but where he really stepped up was his running ability. He became a dual-threat quarterback this season. And I know fantasy football doesn't matter, but he unironically became one of the best fantasy quarterbacks late in the season. The defense was great. We saw breakout years from Dexter Lawrence, who, oh my God, he went from being a solid player to an all-pro first team. But who really deserves all the credit is Brian Daboll. I will talk about him in my NFL awards video. Let's move on to the great tier. These are teams that I could see making a deep run in the playoffs and possibly coming away with the Lombardi Trophy, but I definitely wouldn't bet on it. These two teams are the Cowboys and the Vikings. These two teams have had similar seasons to each other. 1 week, they're great. The next week, they're struggling a little bit, but they still pull off a nice close win. The next week, they're just completely bad. And that's really why I don't have these two teams in a tier higher. It's just because I don't know what to expect from these two teams. They are unpredictable. And I just think it's really hard to rank a team very high when you don't know what you're going to get from them. Nonetheless, they still both went 12-5. Actually, no, I think the Cowboys went 12-5 and the Vikings went 13-4. So they both had great seasons, which is why I have them in this tier. They were both great teams, but like I said, I just wouldn't bet on them winning a championship. One thing I will say, though, these two teams were extremely fun to watch and have produced some great games this year. Then we got best in the league. This tier is simple. These are the 5 teams that I think are going to win the Super Bowl. If I had to choose a team, it would be one of these 5. We have the Bills, the 49ers, the Eagles, the Chiefs, and the Bengals. The Bengals were the team that I contemplated the most going into this video. I was switching between great teams and best in the league, and I ultimately decided to go best in the league. Because I believe the Bengals are a far more consistent team than both the Cowboys and the Vikings. They just had a somewhat rough start to their season. But once they got out of their little slump, this Bengals team was amazing. The O-line really stepped up. They actually started playing really good and giving Joe Burrow a lot of protection. Their receiving core is obviously great. They have the best receiving core in the NFL in my eyes. And their defense really stepped it up. You look at this Bengals defense on paper, and they're not the most eye-widening thing. There's not a lot of huge, like all-pro, Pro Bowl talent on this Bengals defense. But as an overall just unit, they just play very well. And I think that was a huge part of their success this season. Obviously, we know what they're getting from their offense. They're electric. But their defense, when the Bengals defense is playing really good, this Bengals team is scary. And we saw that in games against teams like the Chiefs. And we could have seen it in a game against the Bills. Obviously, bad things happened that game. But I had faith in the Bengals heading into that game. If you check my predictions from that week, I thought the Bengals were going to beat them. So yeah, I'm really high on these Bengals. I think they are a true threat. And as for the rest of these four teams, I've had the Bills, Chiefs, and Eagles in here all season, and the 49ers I've had in here since week 12. And what I've been saying about them all season, I can still say about them now. They're just really good, almost dominant, and I think one of these five teams will win the Super Bowl. The Super Bowl matchup this year will contain a combination of these five teams. It could be Chiefs Eagles, Chiefs Niners, Bills Eagles, Bengals 49ers. I don't know, but I think the Super Bowl will contain two of these five teams here. And yeah, that's all I gotta say. This has been my final ranking of every NFL team through this regular season. It's been a fun season, guys. I love making these videos. Thank y'all for all the support you have provided me on my first kind of NFL season on YouTube. Because if you can't tell by now, my YouTube channel is based around the NFL, and it will be a lot more lively when the NFL season is going on. But yeah, thank y'all for everything. It's been a great season. Run this video up for me. That's all I gotta say. Peace.